Okay, so before we get started, I just wanted to cover a few things that I've been getting some emails about. So the first couple are the curves for exam 2 and exam 3. As you've probably noted, I have not had a chance to put the points in for exam 2 yet. I will be doing that this week. If you want to calculate your grade, including those points, just add 10 points essentially to your total points earned divided by the total points possible so far. And then eventually exam 3 is going to be another 10-point curve. So you can add 10 points to that exam and be up to date in calculating your exam. And then a few things that students have commented on, and I do appreciate the honest feedback that I've received is, we are looking for ways to improve the course, is that as a course instructor, which is what I am, I don't create the content or have the ability to modify the content. That was done by course designers for ASU. So the errors in the cog books that have been pointed out by students is great because I'm able to communicate that to the course designers, and then they're able to change it and improve it. I mean, it's not great to have errors, obviously, but that's just kind of the process on how that happens. As far as also the structure of the course, this is something that, again, I don't really have any control over. So the structure is solely based on cog books. And for some students, they like this because it gives a lot of flexibility when and where you can study for the course. On the other hand, a lot of students don't like it because it's different than the traditional lecture-based course, which makes it sometimes challenging for students to stay motivated or stay focused if they don't have regular due dates, such as lectures to attend and activities or assignments to complete. And as you've seen, this course is exam heavy. We have 5 exams that are worth 500 of the course points, but the cogbooks modules are also worth 220 points. So remember, that's like 2.2 exams that if you just complete them, you'll get 100%. So that should buffer the grading a little bit. And I'll be honest too, I'm not fully sure why ASU decided to make this course into a half a semester when the in-person version is a full semester. So that is going to, again, change the pace of the course. This is a very fast-paced course, and it's also going to change some of the content. Like we do not cover everything in the online course that is gone over as the in-person, making them slightly different courses. So I just thought, since I have received a few emails from students about that, just to give a little bit of background information about the course itself, kind of my role and my abilities in the course. So that's all I have to kind of start off. If anybody has any comments or questions about that, we can cover that. If not, we can cover some of the content in the course. I guess the only one other thing I guess I should cover real quick is related to the structure. As I've mentioned to a few of you in emails, is that they do not actually want us as instructors to provide additional lectures inside the course, which limits a little bit of what I can do, because they want it to be consistent from semester to semester. And there's more than me, there's multiple instructors that teach this course. So they want it to be consistent across instructors as well. And as far as office hours, again, I've been given some instructions to keep them open-ended and not have set agendas or set lectures to make them too structured, which is why I say I'd like them to be student-led. I try to bring in some examples and pick some activities to go over that I think would be useful concerning the exam. So that now is everything that I have. I'll go ahead and turn it over to the group. And I'll just say, I'm here to support you through office hours, through the support questions in cogbooks, through emails. Never hesitate to reach out if you don't understand something. That's my job, is to support your learning through the course.
One of the objectives says use a mathematical or graphical model to predict the outcome of competition between species. The way how the way how cog books was just explaining that, it didn't really make sense to me. So do you think you could show a more visual way of like how that's done? Because they didn't really show any examples like math problems or things like that.
Sure, no, this is a great question because I agree that number four is a little vague in what you're supposed to get out of that. And one thing I'll give away for the exam, because there are some mathematical equations. There was some of the competition equations, right, where we looked at how competition affects population growth or decline for population one or population two, or species one or species two, as well as the Lock-Volterra model was in the predation, and that showed how predators and prey, their densities can affect different how predators and prey interactions can affect their population growth and decline as well. But because cogbooks didn't have any activities that had you actually practice those math equations, none of those you will not have to do any calculations on this exam. Rather, you will just have to understand it conceptually. And the second part of this, for a graphical model, that goes back to module, was it T14? So I'm going to share one of my screens. Where is it? So this is some of the graphical models that cogbooks went over. Everybody can see the four plots right here, right?
Yes.
Okay, so understanding which direction the populations are going to go, right? So we have N1 and N2, that's population one and population two. We have four plots here showing four possible outcomes of species interaction or specifically species competition here. So does somebody want to, I think these would be great to go over. What's happening in this first plot here to population one?
It looks like they're not interacting much at all. If anything, it looks like the blue, they are like going towards the green and the yellow, or just keeping with themselves.
That's fair because these lines, the purple line and the green line, are this for population one and population two's isoclines. So that determines when the population grows and when the population declines and when the population reaches carrying capacity. I will agree that the lines don't cross in these two top ones, or specifically on this left one. So it may appear that they're not interacting, but conceptually the idea is in all four of these plots, the species are in fact interacting in the wild, and these are graphical representations showing the outcome of those interactions. And what we have here is we have three different areas. We have the yellow area, the blue area, and the green area. And what happens in each of those areas is largely determined by the size of the population. So if we start down here in this lower left corner, we see that we're below population two's isocline and population one's isocline. So what we get is the side arrows show that population two will grow in number or increase in number, and population one will also increase in number. And the directions are on the y-axis shows the growth of population two. So as we go up, that just means that population two is increasing in number. As we go to the right, that means population one is increasing in number. So what we have is these two smaller arrows showing population two is going up, or yeah, population two is going up and population one is going over. So that means they're both increasing because they're below their isoclines, they're below their carrying capacities. And the net effect is this middle arrow. So the net effect, it says we're going to move towards this first isocline. And as long as we're in this small, lower densities or smaller number of organisms for populations one and two, they can, in this area, they can coexist. But when we surpass population two's isocline, this purple line, we see that the arrows change. And now if we look at the outside arrows, we see that it's showing a downward trend, which means population two is decreasing in number because it's surpassed its carrying capacity by going past the isocline. But population one is going to the right still. So that's the same pattern because we're still below their isocline. They're still continuing to increase. So the net effect goes in this direction. And what does this open circle mean on this plot?
Does it mean that there's no overlap?
Well, it's a point of equilibrium, right?
Yeah.
But so the populations have reached a state of equilibrium, but if this circle is open right here, what does it mean for population one? It's in terms of its population numbers.
There's no equilibrium.
No, it is at equilibrium. The equilibrium is just on this at this point in the graph. Is population one have individuals, or is it population zero?
0.
Why would you say that population one would be at zero at this point?
Because it's all the way at like the bottom.
That's
Or
that's a correct statement that it is all the way at the bottom, but we got to think about what do the axes mean again, remember? So let's back up a little bit. On the x-axis, right? We have population one, N1, right? And if we think about it, as we go to the right, that means that population is increasing in number. And it's kind of weird to think about it because we have two populations on two different axes. So on the y-axis, we have population two. So as that one goes up, that population increases. As it goes down, it decreases. So if we have population one on the x-axis and we've gone out all the way over here, this actually means this is population one's carrying capacity. So it's the maximum value that population one can maintain at equilibrium. So what does that mean? What does it mean for population two now if the data point is right here?
it means that population 2 will eventually get bigger.
Not quite. It means that population two actually went to zero. So this plot shows a winner effect in competition. Plot two also shows a winner effect. Plot three shows two possible equilibriums, which we'll get to in a minute. And plot four shows an equilibrium where they can coexist. So the point of this graphical representation is to show four possible scenarios that competition can result in. And this first one is because population one is all the way over here and reached its carrying capacity, and the point of equilibrium for this graph is down here, this shows population one out, reached its equilibrium or carrying capacity, and population two lost and died out and actually went to zero. It went extinct.
Oh, okay. Because the green is represents, I guess I'm a little confused on like what the green and the purple represent. I was looking at it a little differently.
Sure. So the green and the purple, they're called the isoclines, which represent the carrying capacity for the different species. And purple is associated with species two because we have K2 is up here. So this is carrying capacity for population two. And the green line is associated with population one on the x-axis because K1 is down here. So we can have, like, if we have an imaginary dot is right here where the arrow is, we can see that, right?
Yep.
That means that both species have some level of population, but we're further to the right than we are up. So population one is larger than population number two right here, but both are currently in existence. And because the net effect in this area is to push an increase in population one and a decrease in population two, it's going to push us in this direction until we reach equilibrium of hitting the carrying capacity for population one and population two going extinct.
So population 2 has gone extinct because if population 1 reached its carrying capacity, would that be because clearly population 1 like outnumbered population 2? Therefore, if population 2 died out, that gives extra resources for population 1 to thrive and reach its carrying capacity?
Exactly. Yes. Because this competition is going to be about either a single resource or multiple resources. So it is competition over resources. And this is just one scenario that could happen. Because now in figure B, we have the opposite scenario, right? So now you notice the colors switched. So the isoclines have switched positions. And now if we start let's stop in a different spot. If we start up here, we're above both isoclines, which means that we're above both populations' carrying capacities. So that's why these arrows, and this is horizontal here, is going to be associated with population one. Population one is going to go to the left, which on their axis, the x-axis, is going to reduce the population in number. So it's going to be a decrease in population. And we go vertical, that's associated with population number two on the y-axis, and that's going down, but that also means that population two is going to decrease, and that's why the net effect is pushing the arrow downwards back towards their isoclines. So up here at this arrow, both populations are currently in existence and they're both above their carrying capacity, which means they're eventually both going to have to decrease in numbers because they're depleting the resources and they can't sustain up here. So that's why the pattern is to push them back. But if it gets pushed down here into this blue box, we're going to see that we're going to have population one still being pushed to the left. So that's still above the green line. So it's still decreasing in number, but now we have population two, the vertical bar going up, and that's an increase in number. So that's why it's pushing us in this direction. And eventually it'll, if one population is increasing and the other is decreasing, one's going to go to carrying capacity and one's going to go to the floor, go to zero. So that's why in this scenario, when the isoclines are flipped, we see that the point of equilibrium is when population two reaches K2, or its carrying capacity for population two. And on the x-axis, population one has been pushed all the way to zero. So we have population one died out or went extinct, lost the competition, and population two increased to its maximum number to its carrying capacity.
So can I just ask real quick, moving from A to B, is the thing that's changing is the population to carrying capacity? So the purple line is now greater than population one's carrying capacity?
Yes, that's very true. That's a good observation.
Okay, thank you.
And if a population has a greater carrying capacity, it has the potential to have larger numbers, and larger numbers generally helps win in competition. They're less vulnerable to losses, to competition itself. They're less vulnerable to losses from predation, less vulnerable to disease. More organisms can outcompete fewer organisms in a physical altercation potentially. So yeah, so switching those isoclines is going to be kind of the driver there. And here we actually have the carrying capacities in C, they're actually equal, right? So now what matters here, it really matters where we start on this plot. So whoever starts with more numbers is generally going to win out in the competition. Whereas in these, it was kind of over before it started, right? Because population one has the greater carrying capacity, and here population two has a greater carrying capacity than over here. So we could kind of predict who was going to win here, but here it's going to depend on where we start. If we start above, it's going to move it down. And if we shift over here, population two is going to win out. If we shift it this direction, population one is going to die out, or win out rather. Population two will die out. If we start over here, it kind of depends on who grows faster to which population is going to win out. Does that make sense on this figure C, on how we're going to determine who's going to win?
Sort of. So where they overlap, it looks like is it like based on like which arrow is longer in a way?
No, it's not based on which arrow is longer. It's based on what direction the center arrow is pointing. Because the center arrow is the net effect of population one and two, and that's kind of why it's bigger in all cases than these smaller arrows on this that are determining each population. So down here, we're below both lines again, right? So we're below the carrying capacities. So that's why population one will grow and population two will also grow. And the net effect is they're going to both increase and move in this direction on the graph. So right here at this point, they're both still alive. It's just when they reach either the y-axis or the x-axis is when one of them is going to die out. In this scenario,
Oh.
okay. Does that make a little more sense? Because
Yep.
if we come down here to the right, we can see that according to the y-axis, we're above the purple line. So the population has to decrease for population 2, but we're below the green line. So for the x-axis, we can move to the right, which means we increase the population. So we have, if we're increasing 1's population and decreasing 2's population, the net effect is to move towards the x-axis, and the carrying capacity of 1 would be that equilibrium point. But if we're over here, it's going to be the opposite, right? We're above green and below purple, so we're going to move up towards 2 and move on the x-axis to 0, where population 2 now wins out.
Yeah, that makes a lot more sense.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so this one, when we go to A, that's because of the carrying capacity is greater. It's going to almost always tend that population 1 is going to win out. In part B, the carrying capacity of population 2 is bigger, so population 2 is always going to win out. And then in C, they have equal carrying capacities, so it depends on whose population either grows faster or declines faster, and which box we start in or end in is going to determine which population there. It could go either direction, and that's why there's 2 open circles, because there's 2 possible points of equilibrium in this competition result. So what about D now? How do we have an open circle somewhere in the plot? It's not on either the Y or X axis. Neither value has 0. What does that mean?
Does that mean that both populations are just growing and growing since there's
Well, it doesn't necessarily mean they're growing, right? Because if we just look at the value, we look at the value, it's right on both isoclines, right? So it's not above and it's not below. So it means they're stable, right? Because neither one has to, at this point, neither one has to grow and neither one has to decline. So there's equilibrium below their carrying capacities for them to coexist. And it's always, all the arrows are pushing to the middle, pushing towards that equilibrium. So this is the only scenario where the 2 species will coexist. But in order to do so, they have to be below their carrying capacities. So that's why on the purple line, it's not all the way to its carrying capacity, it's pushed back a little bit. And that same thing for the green line, it's not all the way to its carrying capacity here, it's pushed back a little bit below the carrying capacity. And if it goes above the isocline, both of them are decreasing and pushing it back towards equilibrium. If it's below the isocline, it's increasing both populations. And on this side, instead of pushing it outward, it's pushing them inward, where one is decreasing and the other is increasing. And the net effect is for stability, where both populations can exist or coexist at the same time.
So basically the competition is not as big now. It's they're more comfortable, the 2 populations, with each other. They're still competing.
Yeah, you could look at it that way. The competition is not as intense because it does not drive one species to extinction. It allows both of them to persist. Or on the other hand, the resource they're competing over might have increased and be very plentiful, that none of them are, neither species is running out of that resource.
That makes a lot more sense. Thank you.
No problem. Anybody else have any questions about this? This is a real good topic to talk about, because you will see these again, I will say, on the exam.
What would be an example of a question exactly? Like, would it ask like, where's the equilibrium?
Probably not going to ask where the equilibrium is, because there's new numeric values. If there were, that could definitely be a question. It might be more of a multiple choice question, and it might say which figure, A, B, C, or D, will result in species 1 always outcompeting species 2.
Okay.
And which one would that be in this one? Where does species 1 always outcompete species 2?
In A.
Yeah, exactly, in A, because it has the greater equilibrium, and equilibrium is actually when species 1 wins out. Another question could be, which one of these figures allows for the coexistence of the species? And what would we say to that answer, or that question?
D.
Yeah, there, that would be D. That's the only one that, you know, would always lead to a coexistence.
And C would be like, so they're both at an equilibrium. So would it ask like what species shows them? But it depends on where you start from.
Yeah, so maybe a question for C could be, which of these figures is dependent on the growth rate of a population or initial density of a population to determine a winner? And that best answer would be C.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. They're good questions. So there's a question in the chat that says, I was having difficulty with the 3 fundamental responses. Can you provide an example of each response? I'm not positive what is meant by the 3 fundamental responses. If you could elaborate on that in the chat, we could come back to this question.
Oh, like the type 1, type 2, and type 3 from P16, I think.
Ah, functional. Okay, I see that. I follow now. Okay, so there has the 3 types of the functional responses. Yep. So we said type 1, type 2, and type 3. So why don't we back up and let's define what a functional response is according to Cogbooks to start with.
It's the relationship between the density of the prey population and the individual predator consumption.
Yes. And actually, why don't we go ahead and, this is in T16, right? I think
Yeah.
I'm gonna pull up the figures so we can see what it is. Okay. Okay, so this is, so we have some description, and then we have the visuals of this, and we have, in the figures, we have the density of prey population, and then the number of prey consumed per predator. All right, and we're asking the functional response is just to describe essentially these 3 different curves. So what's happening with a type 1 response? We're seeing that there's an increase in the number of prey consumed per predator as the density of prey population also increases, and then there's this sharp curve to the right where it flattens out. So how would we describe that in words, what we're seeing in this figure?
So you
It
have
has a linear,
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say it has a linear increase and then it plateaus.
Yeah, so there's something happening at this plateau, right? So we're collecting, it's, as the density increases, it's consuming more up to a certain point, and then it completely stops consuming. What's happening at this curve or at this change in direction?
I think the text said the predator is full, satiated.
Yeah, exactly. Say predator satiation, right? So the more prey there are, the more they eat up till they're satiated, and then they stop eating. So an example of this that I found in Cogbooks, I think, was web building spiders. So we can think of, if more insects are hitting their web, they're collecting more and more food, but they're only able to eat their food as fast as they're able to satiate. So, right, so it'll continue to eat, at an increasing rate, and then it'll just stop feeding, even as that population density increases. It can't keep up with the food that's hitting its web. Now, what's going on with the type 2 curve? It looks similar to a type 1, but it's slightly different.
It looks like the predator population doesn't get full until the density of the prey population reaches its capacity, because it goes up, and then it starts to plateau way at the end. Like, it's not as sharp as type 1.
Yeah, right. So as the population or the density of the prey population increases, we're seeing the number consumed also increase, but then it kind of tapers off, right? So that what's happening that's causing it to taper off? Does anybody remember from what Cogbook said?
They have to spend more time manipulating the prey to consume it.
Yeah, so handling the prey becomes challenging, right? So I think that one of the examples they went over was a pelican. If it catches one fish, it's real easy to move in its mouth and swallow it. 2 fish, a little bit harder, but it can still do it pretty quickly. But 10 fish, it's got to spend some time manipulating all those fish around so it doesn't choke itself, right? So handling the prey is kind of what is causing this tapering effect here. And then type 3, we see it's a little different. We kind of have this S-shaped curve. So we kind of have the opposite effect. We're at low prey density. The number of prey consumed is lower, but then it increases and then it begins to decrease again. So why would a low prey population cause a low prey consumption rate? The Cogbooks went over, there were 3 possibilities for this. But one of them
The
just
prey
said,
could be hard
Go
to
ahead.
find, or they could lack practice catching the prey, or they could be using an alternative food source.
yeah, so those are all 3, right? So the first one is that prey at low density can hide in refuges and they're just difficult for the predator to find. So when there's not a lot of them around, they're not consuming a lot of them. But as more and more of them are around, they become more predictable and there's just more of them around, so they're easier to catch. The second one is that at low population, the predators have less practice locating and catching the prey, right? So they're just not as good as catching the prey, but the more they do it, because there's more of them around, the more efficient type predator they become. And then the third one could be, they call it prey switching. So that's just at low densities, they switch from one prey to another prey. They kind of become more of a generalist and they try to catch whatever's available to them. So they're not very good at catching a variety of prey. But as anything becomes more populated, they become easier to find and easier to catch. So they can increase even across prey types of higher capture rate. And then again, it tapers off, and this is going to become a mix of predator satiation and predator handling too for type 3. They can only be so efficient and capture so many prey before they kind of exceed or reach their top level of efficiency.
Something I didn't understand on this page, what is the part B? What is that graph saying or illustrating?
So that's the proportion of prey consumed, and they switched it because the x-axis is the same as prey density, and then the number of prey versus a proportion. So this is just, on the part A is just straight raw numbers, like this could be 5, 10, 15, 20. And this is going to be a proportion. So maybe they catch 20% of the prey available, or they get a little bit more efficient. So they catch, 30%, 40. And then as they satiate and it flattens, they become less efficient because there's more, they catch, say the most they can catch is 40. So up here is going to be 40 out of 60 is their best. And then it's going to be 40 out of 70, 40 out of 80, 40 out of 90. So they become less efficient technically. So the proportion of the
I see.
total
So it's
prey.
just it's illustrating the same concept, just with a different axis. Is that?
Yep. Yeah, it's the same concept, right? Because this is just raw numbers on the y-axis, and now this is proportion, so it's something, it's a division, right? So it's, you know, A over B.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yep, no problem.
So quick general question, are we gonna be allowed another note sheet on this exam?
So for this exam, no, there won't be a note sheet, but you can use scratch paper.
Okay.
I'm joining a bit late. Is there going to be any math that we have to physically work out on this exam?
Fair question. No, because there were no activities that had you do any sort of calculations, you won't have to do any actual calculations, which is part of why there won't be notes allowed, because you don't have to have the equations memorized. You'll have to know there's the competition equations, and then like the predator prey Lock-Volterra equations. Know what they mean conceptually in a broad sense. So, you know, what is Lock-Volterra telling us? It's calculating prey and predator densities over time, and the more complicated versions add in lag effects to show us how resources potentially can have an impact, or how the predator and prey have an impact on each other. So for example, if the predator population booms and goes up, the prey population will tend to decrease, and then over time the predator population is also going to decrease, and then there's going to be, when that decreases, there's going to be the opposite, you know, the increase, and you get that cyclic effect. But then they're not right on top of each other, rather there's that lag, because it takes time to convert energy such as food into population numbers, meaning the offspring.
Perfect. Thank you.
I was really struggling with the activities in T18 where we identify the keystone species. Can you like walk us through the thought process on that?
Sure. Oh, that's 14. That's why. 17, 18. I think this was in the, they called it critical thinking, but it's the same thing as an activity. Yeah, so let me. So like this type question here, which member of the community do you expect to be a keystone species, and explain your answer?
Yes, I was just really struggling with the thought process because it seems like such a subjective classification, you know, where we could call multiple ones keystone species.
Yeah, and I think that's a fair assessment, because you could make biological arguments for different keystone species. So one thing to maybe, a couple things maybe to keep in mind when looking for a keystone species is they generally are, but they're not always, some of the predators, because a keystone species, one of the things they do is they do act as, they don't have to be a top predator, but they generally have to be a predator of some sort, because they control levels of competition below them that prevent the dominant competitor from pushing the less dominant competitor to extinction. So they allow multiple species to stay alive below them through predation. And I think that's why this one, it says that their example was the killer whale, because they predate on seals and a lot of species that are actually competing with each other. So the harp seal, the ring seal, and the harbor seal, they all share the same prey species as the Arctic cod. So that's another thing to look for, is as a predator, does the prey have a lot of shared resources? Because that's important for keeping each of those competitors alive. And another one to look for is kind of doing like a back count of how many organisms does the perceived keystone species affect. The more species you can link it to through going through those back arrows, the more likely it'll be that that is the keystone species in that example. But I will say for the exam, if you get a question like this, which you'll see a chart like this, and you make an argument, I would be open to biological discussions of why you think another one is the keystone species, and be more than open to giving full or partial credit, for those types of answers. So don't, hesitate if you think the one that you picked is correct for, reasons A, B, and C. Because I agree that they don't give a mathematical way to calculate it. So there is some level of subjectivity to it. I mean, I would describe it as there are better answers than others, and that's what we're looking for here. Because these models actually do have math involved in them. We don't cover that in this course, so we're not responsible for it, but there are ways, in more advanced ways to actually calculate what has a higher probability of being a keystone species compared to others.
Okay, so if we're asked about this, we may be given the opportunity to explain our reasoning and possibly petition you for like points if we didn't initially get points.
Yes,
If our reasoning is sound.
Yeah, you'll absolutely be, the option is to send me, hey, I got, I lost this many points on question 12. I thought it was this answer for these reasons. And if you can explain some of the ones that we just went over, like it affects the same number of species as the one listed. They both affect 6, and here's the, the linear line that I traced to it. That would definitely get some points back. If you say like it's a predator to multiple competitors that have a shared resource, that's another point to really point out. That would get even more points back potentially. And there's a couple that it might be like they're the same, but this one affects 7 species and this one affects 6. So to absolutely call it the keystone species is probably not correct. So you could definitely get points back on it.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Just one question on this topic. Would a good, when we're given something like this on the exam, would a good thing kind of question to ask yourself is what species is regulating a group of competitors going after the same prey?
Yeah, that'd be a great way to put it.
Okay, thank you.
And another thing to think about too is what would happen if the species was removed? How many species would it potentially impact? And would it have potentially a negative impact and allow for a lot more competition that would go unchecked? Because the idea is when you have a keystone species, if you remove them, that population should have some major casualties to it, and the diversity should decrease in that environment.
Okay, thank you.
Were there any other specific topics that anyone wanted to go over?
Can we go over the predator graphs like we did the competition graphs?
Sure, which, that would be in,
It's T16 and it is in trajectories of predator and prey system.
oh, okay. All right. So you're talking about these plots right here?
Yes, and the
Okay.
one below it.
Sure, so let's start at the top. So what we have here is we have the number of predators on the y-axis and the number of prey on the x-axis. And we have two boxes and the arrows are going left to right in A, right? And what we have here on this dotted line, this is the prey isocline. So if we go above the isocline, right, that means it's essentially, we can think of it as the carrying capacity. The prey is going to decrease in number, so that's why the arrow is going to the left in the upper blue box, and if we're below it, the prey can go to the right in this lower yellow box. So does that make sense so far, why they're going left to right in part A?
Yes.
Okay, and then in part B, it's the same axes. So again, we have the number of predators on the y-axis and the number of prey on the x-axis, but now it's a vertical line talking about the predator isocline. And it's left to right because now it's the predator. So if we're below the to the left of the predator isocline, we're going to have a decrease in the number of predators. And if we're to the right, oh no, sorry. So if we're to the left of it, it's decreasing the number of predators because we have a low number of prey here. And if we're to the right, it's increasing the number of predators because we have a higher number of prey. So this is kind of what would get at the cycle, that it would almost like be circular, where predators are going to decline at low prey levels and predators are going to increase their numbers at high prey levels. Does that make sense for part B now?
Yes.
Okay, and this is kind of, you know, meant to be a simplified version of what they get into here, and that's why now what I've been kind of doing with my mouse is making that circular pattern, because it's going to go
Oh,
in
it's the
in a
two
cyclic.
combined. I
Yes.
see. Okay.
Yeah, so right here we have the number of prey on the x-axis and the number of predators. So the same thing on the axes, but we can go to any box right here, right? An increase in predation population causes a decline in the prey population. So that's why it's moving to the left. And then a decrease in the prey population causes a decrease in the predator population. That's going to move the number of predators down again, and the number of prey down again as well. And like these are, and it's just the cycle here that it goes for. And we don't have to do the math, but mathematically they're showing using the point of equilibrium could be somewhere here in the middle if they were to say stay stable. But we know conceptually predator and prey populations don't really stay stable, they fluctuate, and that fluctuation has an impact on both the predator and the prey, but they can stay alive because they go through those fluctuations where when one crashes the other crashes, because if the other one kept climbing, it would drive its prey all the way to zero potentially, and then that predator would crash to zero. And then this is taking it even further, showing that lag effect, that as at this point, you know, because we have low predator numbers, we have rising prey numbers, which allows then the predators to also rise. And when they get to a certain point, we get that inflection point where the predators have now reached a certain point where they're actually going to cause a decrease in that prey. But how come the predator doesn't follow the prey right away when it starts to decrease? Like through this whole area right here, we have decreasing number of prey, but we still have an increasing number of predators up all the way over here. What's causing that lag effect?
It's got to have time to respond to the change in the size of the other population.
Yeah, and what is the response to get more detailed?
To either die more or reproduce more or less?
Yeah, exactly. Right. So energetics is one of the characters we're talking about, right? So a predator can eat a bunch of prey and have a really good body condition, but it's not immediately going to convert all those resources that it consumed into offspring. It's going to take time to produce that offspring, and it might overshoot its carrying capacity and produce a bunch of offspring right here where the prey population is declined, and then have kind of a crash in its population. So it takes time to convert that energy into actual population numbers. And predators can go hungry for a period of time while they have less prey and go into lower body condition before they actually start starving to death and actually dying off, or not having enough resources or energetics to convert into offspring. So they might miss a reproductive cycle because their body doesn't have enough resources to, make that offspring. Or they have very few offspring, maybe only one, so they're less than reproducing or replacing themselves. They're still having, some offspring, but not enough, and it still causes the population to go down in numbers.
Okay, you explaining those graphs helped a lot. Thank you.
Oh, good. It's a good question. I'm glad. Good help. One thing we haven't talked about yet, but it's probably maybe good to discuss, is apparent competition. So let's talk about what it is and walk through maybe the example that they gave us in cogbooks. So the first thing is, how would we define it?
I just had down that it looks like competition, but it's not.
Yes, and what does competition involve?
The direct contact between two species, or they're
Well, it
sharing a
doesn't.
resource.
Yeah, that's what I was looking for. It doesn't have, we can have indirect and direct competition. So we could have competition, but it all circles around or centers around a resource, right? So there's at least two species or two organisms. It could be inter or intra, we could call it. Let's say it's inter, two different species, because of the example in cogbooks they used was the partridge and the pheasant, right? So those are the two, they shared a common resource in food and space even. But when they were together, it was the partridge that did not do very well. They actually had lower numbers than the pheasants. And why was that? It wasn't because the pheasant was outcompeting it for food. What was the part that made it an apparent competition?
It was more susceptible to fatality from that disease that they could both contract, right?
Yeah, so the kicker and apparent is it takes three different types of organisms. And one of them is almost invisible, we could say, right? So let's call it parasite A. I forget which one it is exactly, and the detail's not vital. But they had, when they were together, they could both get, the pheasant and the partridges could both get this parasite. The parasite did not cause much harm to the pheasant, so it just went about its way. It's like I carried this parasite, but it didn't kill it. The partridge, on the other hand, when it got this parasite, it really struggled and its population dropped. So when the partridge was around the pheasant actually gave it the parasite to the partridge, and it appeared that the pheasant was a superior competitor, when really the partridge was just more susceptible to this shared parasite. Because when they separated them, they did fine, and when they actually treated both birds so that neither of them had this parasite, they also did fine. And that's the evidence that it wasn't actual competition between each other. It was the apparent competition by adding that third organism that only affected the partridge negatively and didn't affect the pheasant negatively. that scenario make sense?
Yes.
Okay. I think maybe another thing that would be good to discuss as a group is questions 1 and 2. We can kind of mix them in the topics and learning objectives. So this is talking about species interactions. So why don't we first name and define the 4 types of species interactions that Cogbooks went over, and then we can talk about a little bit more detail about them. So what are the interactions that we went over?
That'd be the competition, mutualism, predation, and parasitism.
Predation, parasitism can be kind of lumped as the same, and then the other one would be
Okay.
herbivory, because that all of those are kind of similar in a sense. What's the difference between predation and herbivory? Because aren't they both technically a form of predation?
It's just the different trophic level, right?
Yeah,
What kind of consumer they are.
yeah. So herbivory, what is the prey specifically?
The producers, the plants.
Yeah, right. So herbivory is just they're predating on plants only, versus predation could be plants, other organisms, animals or fungi or whatever. It's just open to any consumption. And herbivory is just a very specific version of predation. All right, now let's talk about each one of those maybe individually. So some of the activities had you say it was positive for both, positive for one, negative for one, or negative for both. What is mutualism? If we describe that, how does it affect the 2 organisms involved in that mutualism?
Positive for both.
Yes, and why would it be positive for both?
They're both using each other for some kind of benefit.
Yeah, so their interaction is giving them a fitness benefit, right? So they both gain towards their fitness in a mutualism. What about competition?
Usually negative, negative.
Yes, and why is it both negative? Why isn't it positive for the winner?
Because there is that competition. So the conflict was there that somehow reduces their fitness in one way or another.
Yeah, competition has a cost associated with it, right? It costs time, it costs energy. There's trade-offs, right? If you're out competing with an organism in a direct competition and say it gets physical, you can't be, reproducing, you can't find a mate, you can't be eating, you're focused solely on that physical competition. Also, say you win the physical interaction of the competition, but now you have a wound and you're weaker. So you might have defended your territory, but because you're injured, another competitor can come in and displace you. So there's many costs associated with competition. You could even die from competition. Maybe you win the fight, but your wound is infected and you die from the infection. So your net gain is a total loss in your fitness. What about herbivory?
Is that a positive, negative?
Yes, and which is the positive and which is the negative?
The predator, whoever's getting plants is going to get the positive and the plant's going to get the negative.
Yeah, and why is that?
One is gaining a resource that's going to give it energy and the other one is getting taken out.
Yep, exactly. So it's pretty straightforward. Predation is the same way as herbivory, and parasitism is essentially the same as the parasite gains the benefit of the resource and the host loses some resource, whether it be blood or energy, and it gains no benefit. The only difference here is in parasitism, is it good or bad if the parasite kills its host?
Bad, assuming that it doesn't rely on fatality to spread to another host. Because
Yeah,
some
so
parasites do rely on fatality.
yeah, that's a great answer. It would be, it depends. Generally, a host or a parasite doesn't want to kill its host because the idea is it doesn't have another, unless it has another host readily available. So if it's kind of isolated on its host and it kills its host, it kills itself, right? But in other certain circumstances, it could be that it can transfer to another host. But I would say that in the long run, the net benefit, if it could keep its host its whole life and it keeps it alive, it's probably a good thing to keep that host alive and not have to risk having to transfer to another host. So how do these mutualism, competition, herbivory, predation, and parasitism, how does that relate to overall like species diversity or in habitat diversity? What does mutualism do for diversity?
Would it increase diversity?
Yeah, it generally has an increase in diversity. What about competition?
Decrease?
Yeah,
Or does it
competition. Sorry, what was that?
Nothing, sorry.
Your first part that I heard saying that it decreases, yes, it generally decreases. And why would competition decrease diversity?
Would it be because one ultimately outcompetes the other for a resource?
It's possible that it could drive, one competitor could drive another to extinction and decrease diversity that way. So that is true. Competition also means that they're defending or hoarding or a certain resource. So it's not allowing invaders to come in, right? So it's going to defend that resource from all sorts of competitors. Potential new competitors that come in might get driven off and not be able to become part of that community. So it kind of deflects newcomers or migration even to that community. What about mutualism? Why would we argue that that would increase diversity? Maybe we can think about what types of mutualisms do we have?
I was just gonna add to that, would the obligate mutualism end up decreasing diversity?
That obligate mutualism could potentially, if one were to die out and the other one required it, it could have caused them both to die out. So that is a possible scenario where it could have, a decrease. But I think the reason they say it's a net win-win is because you can have more of a generalist mutualism across several species. So if two die out potentially, but you have more generalists that can attract other species to come to that environment that they can interact with, the net effect could be overall positive. And what about herbivory and predation? How does that affect diversity?
Would they both decrease diversity? Or is it dependent on the situation?
So that one with Cogbook's example said that it depends, right? So you can have herbivory that, how could herbivory increase biodiversity? We could think of this as a keystone predator.
One of those examples was it that the animals would eat down the taller plants then allowing the shorter plants to get more sun and access to resources, and then they would grow as well.
Yeah, exactly, right? So you have a deer, say, that there's a plant that grows really fast and is a really strong competitor, but that deer eats that plant and lowers its level of competition. It then allows weaker competitors to persist in that environment and not get out competed. So that deer, in a sense, acts as kind of a gatekeeper to keep all of those organisms alive. When would herbivory maybe decrease diversity?
If the amount of predation ended up driving one of those plants to extinction.
Exactly, right? So if the deer eats one plant completely to extinction, and then moves on to another one and just wiping out that environment, killing it species by species, then it could be really problematic and lower the overall diversity for that environment. Yeah, cool. I think we covered those in pretty good detail.
And for that one, you said we're including parasitism in with predation as well? Or is that going to be its own?
Well, yeah, for all of those, for herbivory, predation, and parasitism, it depends on the scenario for how it affects diversity. So those are all depends, positive or negative. And we could think of examples, for predation, we could replace deer and plant with coyote and rodents, right? A coyote could be a predator of 6 different rodents, and it could increase diversity if it keeps the most competitive rodent from driving its other competitors to extinction by being a predator of all of the rodents kind of equally, or more skewed towards that dominant one to keep them all alive. But if that coyote went and ate all the rodents species by species and killed them off one by one, it would then, decrease its the diversity in that environment. And parasitism could be the same way. If a parasite goes and kills off all its hosts, it's going to crash the diversity of that environment. But if it doesn't kill its hosts, and they can live with the parasite, and the parasite could maybe develop some type of mutualism with another parasite inside, it could create some type of positive effect on the diversity of that environment.
So going back to the predator and prey cycles, I'm looking at number 8 on the study guide. I'm understanding, the ebbs and flows of the whole thing, but what exactly are you looking for in that answer? Would it be discussion of the mathematical models, or just kind of the overall idea that the time lags and everything kind of produce that cycle?
So I would say you could explain this completely conceptually without any math.
Okay.
Some of the basics to it would be, if you have an increase in a prey population, that's generally followed by an increase in predator population because more food is available. So looking at the patterns, when one changes, how does it affect the other one and why? And there's 2 ways for that. So if there's an increase in predator population, the opposite, there's going to be the opposite effect, right? You're going to have a decrease in the prey population, which is then ultimately followed by a decrease in the predator population because of reduced resources for both. And then, like you said, some things you could talk about of why they're not exactly following each other. There's lags. You talk about the lag effects and the energetics and how it takes time for food consumption to be converted into offspring, and how it takes time for lack of resources to lead to starvation and death.
Perfect. Thanks.
So I guess one other thing we haven't talked about yet is Liebig's law of the minimum. So why don't we talk about what that is and why it's not always used?
So it's just saying that a population will increase until the most limiting resource prevents it from getting any further. And it's not used all the time because it assumes that adding in other resources won't help at all.
Yeah, right. So it focuses on one single resource. So say, all organisms are, majority of organisms depend on oxygen, right? So that's going to be potentially a limiting resource. But some other organisms also depend on food, depend on temperature, and there's interactive effects of all these different resources. I think the example that Cogbooks gave was in the plants that it was there was an interaction between light and fertilizer. So it doesn't Liebig's law of the minimum does not always apply in nature or in the laboratory. The main concept is, yes, organisms are dependent on resources, so that holds true, and they generally have one main resource that they depend on, but it's not always the only resource that could drive it like to extinction. There can be, and if it interacts with another resource, it can actually change the effects potentially, or at least ameliorate the effects of depleting that resource. Yeah, so it assumes that each resource has independent effects. And we know that that's not always the case. So in some instances, it holds. In some instances, it does not. And what about the difference between interdependent communities and independent communities? What does that mean and how do we test for those?
So independent would mean that they don't rely on each other, and then interdependent would mean that they do rely on other species within the community to survive.
Yes, I would agree with that. Do you remember what the two methods that Cogbooks went over were to test for this? Like there are two methods they discussed.
One was removing one of the species, right, and seeing how it impacts the rest.
Yeah, so one was a species removal study. So say you have species A and species B, and you remove species B and species A dies out, what would we call that?
Interdependent.
Yes. And how would we know that it's independent? What would happen in that scenario? So we had species A and species B, and we remove species B. What would species A do if it was independent of B?
It would be unaffected by the removal.
Yeah, so it could be either unaffected or it could even increase its fitness or increase its reproduction, right? So say A and B were competitors. If you remove one of its competitor, it might flourish. So at the very least, it's going to stay the same and be unaffected, and it's possible that it might actually increase its production. And the other one, that was line transects. So do you remember what a line transect is and what we should see on that line transect as far as species groupings?
Like you should be seeing species appearing and disappearing together if it's interdependent.
Yes. So
Yeah.
yeah, like the name says, it's a line and it's a transect. So you just walk in a straight line and you say you started to walk, you identify the species, you have species A, B, and C, and then you keep walking and the A, B, and C all kind of they're there, and then 100 feet away, they're kind of not there, and you have species like D, E, and F. So you have a new group of species. Or you don't see, if they're interdependent, you don't see A with D, E, and F, you just see it with like A, B, and C, and maybe you keep walking and then A, B, and C appear and D, E, and F disappear. So seeing that clustering of species together in different locations is going to give evidence that they're interdependent or essentially dependent on each other. If they're independent, you're going to see the species sporadically. You might see A and B here, A and D up there, you know, D and F over there, F and A over there, and there's no real pattern to it because they're independent of each other and they can kind of be anywhere.
That reminded me, on the very last think back, it referenced altitudinal clines, and I have no clue what that is.
Altitudinal clines. So that's just change in elevation. So going up or down a mountain. So higher and lower altitude, or just moving through the country. Yeah. So just, and a cline is just like a gradual change of that. It could be, you know, a temperature cline would be going from warm to cold. An altitudinal cline is just going from low to high. And
So cline is like a general change in like an abiotic effect, or a geographical region, or a niche or something.
Yeah, it could be a change in an abiotic factor over a geographical range.
Okay, thank
you. And a cline can be applied to like a biotic effect. You might see like a gradual, like across that geographic cline that we talked about, where say temperature changes or altitude changes, we see a change in biotic factors such as species. So we might see certain plants at lower altitudes, and as we go further along that cline, higher, we see different species. So it's like a gradient effect. So I'm looking at the learning objectives and the topics, and the only thing that we really haven't touched on would be maybe number 15, talking about designing an experiment to establish whether two species interact through competition, mutualism, or predation, herbivory. And it's asking what factors would you manipulate and what patterns would you predict? And I think maybe we can talk about this in more of a general sense on how we would go about answering a design and experiment question, because this would be kind of open-ended. What are some things that we would need to include in an experiment? In any experiment, really.
you. Always got to have a control, right?
Yeah, exactly where I'm going. You have a control, and what's essentially the opposite of a control? If it's manipulative.
The test group.
Yeah, the test group, or we call it a treatment group, you know, so we could call it either one is fine, but having a control, treatment, test group. You wanted to maybe talk about replication. So how many times you want to replicate it. And it doesn't have to be crazy. We could say we're going to replicate it 3 times. So that way if we have a tie, we have a tiebreaker, right? So just saying we're going to do it more than 1 time. And then you want to get into some of the nitty gritty, like what are the specific measurements you're going to take? So if we're working with plants and we want to look at competition, a good thing to measure is maybe plant height. What is the total height, or plant density, how many plants we're going to measure. So just, you got to remember the specifics of what you're recording. What is the treatment? Is it, if we're talking about plants again, is it light treatment, fertilizer, water? What are you exactly manipulating? Some things you want to talk about is handling, right? So although you have a control group that maybe you're not giving fertilizer to, you might give it something that's like a pretend fertilizer, put something in the soil that's not going to act as a fertilizer, but it might still gives it that same handling effect. So we can't say just adding something to the soil over here might be the effect, right? Maybe you add a salt to the soil instead of a fertilizer, something as your control, and then you have another control group where you add nothing and just kind of till up the soil a little bit. Yeah, we got some of these in the chat too. Somebody said control group, so great. And then you also want to talk about endpoints, right? So you could say, I'm going to measure plant growth. And you could say, okay, but for how long? You might say plant growth for, 1 month or something, or 1 growing season. So just adding in some of those specifics, because the thing you always want to remember designing an experiment is, if somebody else were to do this experiment with what I've written down, will they be able to do the general experiment to get this, not necessarily the same results, but to get comparable results? What do they need to replicate this? And again, if you get asked this on the exam, you wouldn't need to write out, 5 pages, but just having maybe, a solid paragraph of some information would be suffice. And I would recommend always keep experiments simple. If you say I want to test, 10 replicates, then it gets complicated with interactive effects. And, just I would have 1 treatment, 1 control, and leave it kind of at that. Are there any questions on experimental design?
So are you implying that we would need to get specific and use like a example, not just like write out the steps of like a scientific experiment?
Yeah, most likely you would have to come up with an example.
Okay.
And then also make sure to pay attention, because I didn't ask it out loud, but reading the second part of this question, it says, what factors would you manipulate? We covered that. And what patterns would you predict? So that's, make sure if it's a 2-part question, we read the whole thing. So we could say what patterns. We say, if I'm going to treat these plants A with fertilizer and group B without fertilizer, I would predict group A with the fertilizer to grow, because fertilizer acts as a growth enhancement by providing additional nutrients to the plant and thus being able to allocate it to growth. So something like simple like that would be, perfectly good prediction, and with the why in there, because we always want to have our biological why of why we predict something is going to happen. Okay, is there any other specific activities or topics that anybody wanted to go over? Okay, if not, yeah, I think that's good. We covered a lot of ground tonight, so thank everybody for coming out and participating. I think we can go ahead and end the session.